This brings us back to the paradox of fascism and the way in which fascism differs from totalitarianism. For totalitarianism is a state affair. It essentially concerns the relation between the state as a localized assemblage and the abstract machine of overcoding it effectuates. Even in the case of a military dictatorship, it is a state army, not a war machine, that takes power and elevates the state to the totalitarian stage. Totalitarianism is quintessentially conservative. Fascism, on the other hand, involves a war machine. When fascism builds itself a totalitarian state, it's not in the sense of a state army taking power, but of a war machine taking over the state. A bizarre remark by Virilio puts us on the trail. In fascism, the state is far less totalitarian than it is suicidal. There is in fascism a realized nihilism. Unlike the totalitarian state, which does its utmost to steal all possible lines of flight, fascism is constructed on an intense line of flight, which it transforms into a line of pure destruction and abolition. It is curious that from the beginning, the Nazis announced to Germany what they were bringing, at once wedding bells and death, including their own death and the death of the Germans. They thought they would perish, but that their undertaking would be resumed all across Europe, all over the world, throughout the solar system. And the people cheered, not because they did not understand, but because they wanted that death through the death of others. Like a will to wager everything you have, every hand, to stake your own death against the death of others and measure everything by deliometers.
The very rules of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is to the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, we just want to mention briefly, we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider donating $1 a month to the cause there. We are now making available access to the Discord server. We've got some bonus content on some older reading group material that Taylor has been so kind to host for us, and we hope to bring back some reading groups once we figure out some scheduling issues we've been having. There's a lot of flux. There's a lot of quanta and little micro things happening.
Especially when I move, I'll be able to resume those. Come join us on the Discord, and in November around our birthday time, we'll be doing reading groups again.
Yeah, we'll try to get it all lined out. That is definitely a purposeful pun.
Mm-hmm. I'm picking up what you're throwing down, brother. That's good.
So today we're going to be we're returning to A Thousand Plateaus, I should start off with. We're looking at 1933, Micropolitics and Segmentarity. And just to ask you, if I can ask you a personal question, it would be, do you ever flee from flight? Or have you ever flown from flight? I can't conjugate these verbs.
I think fleed. I've flown and fleed from flight. I've got a lot of miles racked up in my flee card in the sky. Now that was I forget who they were quoting. We'll have to find that little, I think they're quoting someone, right? When they mention fleeing from flight. Are they quoting
Is
Nietzsche?
it Spinoza?
Here's the quote. It's on 227. The values, morals, fatherlands, religions, and private certitudes our vanity and self-complacency generously grant us are so many abodes the world furnishes for those who think on that account that they stand and rest amid stable things. They know nothing of the enormous route they are heading for in flight from flight. It's a footnote 29. They're quoting, what the wrong chapter? They're quoting Blanchot.
Okay.
Blanchot. They're quoting his book Friendship, which may not have been translated by this time. I believe it has been. Now they cite the French, but that's interesting. I would have never guessed that's Blanchot, although he's very Nietzschean and important for Deleuze for various reasons that don't concern us right now. But we flee from fright. Rigidifier segments, give ourselves over to binary logic. The harder they have been to us on one segment, the harder we will be on another. We reterritorialize on anything available. The only segmentarity we know is molar at the level of the large-scale aggregates we belong to, as well as the level of the little groups we get into, as well as at the level of what goes on in our most intimate and private recesses. Yeah, you didn't you screenshot this and text it to me? Something I remember the line about a man comes home and says, "Is the grub ready?" And the wife answers, "What a scowl! Are you in a bad mood?" Two rigid segments in confrontation. Yeah, and if you remember in the three novellas, we did, as I said, they introduce the segments, right, in their reading of the different novellas. They give us hints of the lines and supple segmentation and things like that, and the rigid segments and the quanta, but as I said last time, it's in this chapter that they really try to unpack all of that. So
yeah, I really enjoyed how this provided so much clarity and so many different avenues. And
that's one of the dangers. No, I'm kidding.
Right, it is. It's one of the four dangers, right?
Sorry, you said it provided clarity on A Thousand Plateaus, maybe.
Yeah, just even
capitalism and schizophrenia.
So far, this is my favorite plateau, I believe.
And we're not even like halfway through the book, are we?
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, we're not even halfway through the book, but yeah, it does. It really brings the room together. It really ties the room together.
Because I was not vibing that much with the A Thousand Plateaus so far. I wasn't enjoying the reading so much until three novellas started cooking a little bit, and then this took things a little bit further. Maybe it's my love of Leibniz, also the Virilio stuff in here.
Yeah, their use of Virilio. He'll come back again later, but yeah, their reliance on his notion of, we read in the cold open, of the state or of this suicidal line of flight. Yeah, that the state becomes suicidal. That's Virilio's contribution here in this. Although they do also reference them in terms of this question of security and insecurity. So yeah, Virilio. But I also think at some point, okay, tell us some more of your reflections, because you said that you weren't really vibing, but this might have, once you thought you were out, we pulled you back in.
I believe so. I think that really, we talked a little bit about Leibniz last time in three novellas, fairly extensively, I think. But this really drove that home, as you hinted it would. So that was great. I think really getting the understanding of how the differential calculus functions as such a apt metaphor for the way that, for example, the molar and the molecular work, as far as that goes. So I really brought that into crystal, like a clarity that I hadn't understood. And how many hours have I sat here and listened to people talk about this shit? But it's not until now that I kind of like that. It's like putting together a puzzle, and I've got some edges, and like, you know, but the pictures begins to come together a little bit more clearer. So there's that.
Go ahead. Keep going.
I'm trying to think what else really stood out as far as this. Some of the stuff is still
some of the examples
blurry.
They use maybe were interesting, right?
Yeah.
Like the analysis of sin, the fall of the Roman Empire, even like their analysis of money, and then obviously the concept, which I think is important here, because they still haven't, as they'll have a whole plateau on the war machine, so they still haven't really unpacked that concept yet, even though they've been using it. But the concept of microfascism, right, was a pretty big. I feel like it stands out very, very strongly in this plateau, and their ability to distinguish totalitarianism and microfascism.
Yeah, I mean that's maybe an interesting jumping off point, because it was definitely like making that distinction, which I think, you know, is not uncommon to hear, but to really flip, like to show that fascism is like hijacks, so to speak, this line of flight, and you can really see how that plays out. Like, I think our current social and political situation, at least in the United States, and I'm sure elsewhere, right? Like, it feels very eerily reminiscent of a lot of what they describe in this chapter as it pertains to fascism.
I do think it's interesting that, as we said last time, and I think that there's a point where they lay out some rules. I don't say rules, some like rules of thumb, maybe. Let me see if I can find it. The 4 errors concerning molecular and supple segmentarity to be avoided. That's on page 215. And I think I brought up last time at least one of the first one, which is they say the first error is axiological, right? It has to do with making value judgments and consists in believing that a little suppleness is enough to make things better, quote unquote. And they say no, because suppleness is what makes microfascisms dangerous, right? It's on the molecular level, obviously. That hence the prefix micro. So don't make the value judgment. Don't assume that a certain value judgment that suppleness is better than rigidity. And I think you brought up an example of this in our text exchange earlier today.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. Interestingly enough, I was thinking about this more so to do with Virilio, because which we discussed. I think they directly are referencing, what is it, Speed and Politics.
Okay.
And in that book, Virilio discusses, I think, really, he's focused on territory, the management of space,
Yes.
and speed, which really I started to think about in terms of the like a roundabout, a driving roundabout versus a stoplight or even a stop sign, because a roundabout allows a sort of, it really allows for more, certainly it slows things down a bit, right? But it's not as rigid as a stoplight or a stop sign that demands a full-on halt. So if you can yield to a car, and then but you don't necessarily have to stop, you can slow down, you know what I mean? It facilitates movement in a way that in a certain way could be more efficient and more contingent to traffic flows than a stop sign or a stoplight, because as we've all probably experienced, you pull up to a stoplight at, I don't know, 2 a.m, right? And you're just sitting there. There's
Yep.
there's no cars around, right? But you're still trapped in the kind of, this is an example of kind of the rigid segmentarity, where I think the roundabout would be a more supple system, because it allows a certain contingent flow, whether traffic be heavy or light. It doesn't really slow down the speed of transit so much the way that a stoplight or a stop sign even would.
The other thing too, because I love your analysis here, because it even brings in flows, right? Literal flows of traffic. I would say too that it's not just more supple than the rigidity of the stop sign, but we're also dealing now with the different segments that they bring up, right? Let's look at that. That's on the very first page, right? So we obviously have the kind of binary segmentation, right? Stop, go. Whereas really with the roundabout, it's yield and merge and take your pick of which of the routes you're taking. I guess that's what I mean. Like the stop, go, or the stop sign is more of the linear type of segmentarity, and the roundabout is literally in the name. It's circular. So those are the three ways in which we are segmented, or in which life is segmented, and which all manner of things are segmented, that they plateau with, right? The binary segmentation, circular, and linear, all of which coincide and coexist, but obviously to different degrees. And so, yeah, I really do like that analysis or that example.
Yeah, that was all Virilio. Just, I thought, really, I wish you would have honestly used that example, because that would have fit so well in the book, right? Because it's about managing space and speed in the
Yep.
urban setting, I think, in particular.
Yeah.
But I think something's to their point, which you brought up, a little suppleness isn't enough, right? Because the same example of this roundabout, right? Like, it can't, because of the sort of the lack of rigidity, can become, like, at a certain threshold, that becomes chaotic, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm thinking of
Yeah.
driving in somewhere like Rome or Mexico City or some places like that, where it's like, there's too, like, it's too supple, there's too much shit.
Gotcha.
And you can't, navigating that is like becomes overwhelming, I think, as an
Washington
example.
DC is a good Washington DC. I remember being a nightmare driving in. So that's just my example, since I haven't driven in those cities you named.
I'm just basically thinking of, I don't know, movies, TV shows,
Gotcha.
I don't know,
Yeah.
yada yada. But I also wanted to point out something too about, which was, I think, interesting. I'll have to get your take on this, but I'll get there in a moment. So I was also thinking, relative to suppleness, not versus rigid segmentarity,
Mhm.
is, again, they don't want to or say that one is good and one is bad in a sort of transcendent way, right? Because for example, going back to the gift economy, in which they reference quote unquote primitive peoples here in the
And
text.
they use scare quotes in the text too, right? When they say modern and primitive. Anyway, go on.
So I was thinking back to the Jean Schrader book we read. What was it?
Yeah.
Eroticism of the Market, gift in the market, something like that. And
that sounds close. It might be. Anyway, go on. It doesn't matter.
Right, because in the economic systems, so in the potlatch economy or the gift economy, for example, versus modern capitalism, which is really dominated by contract exchange versus gift exchange, the gift economy is a lot more supple in that there's less rigidity. There's no interest rate per se that has to be met specifically within a potlatch, right? In the potlatch exchange, there's no set rate of interest that one must calculate per se, right? There's not this state implemented interest rate that dominates how that sort of exchange would be governed.
Right.
But you have to return do the counter gift in excess of the gift that you receive. So there is a type of interest involved in the gift exchange. But due to the lack of contract where things are clearly delineated, again, this goes back, similar example to the stop sign, stop light, right? There's no ambiguity, or there's a lot less ambiguity, I should say, in between as far as how one should act, right? Because the contract clearly states you pay $100 on the first of the month, for example, and there's a 3% interest rate, right? That provides a lot of clarity. That provides, you can plan long term as far as your expenses are concerned, versus the gift economy. There's a lot more ambiguity present in the exchange process, because yes, you have to return that gift with a certain amount of quote unquote interest or excess of what the gift that you received. So the reciprocity, the circular reciprocity, which they discuss as well here relative to the quote unquote primitive society, right? So that becomes that ambiguity in the gift economy, like certainly I think is an example of a more supple economy, but there's still a rigidity present, right? Because it's war by gift. Like there's a violence that undergirds the gift. When is a gift not a gift? You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I remember us discussing that. When is a gift not a gift? Yeah,
I'm quoting Dune.
No, I know, but it works perfectly here. And the book, the Schrader book, The Triumph of Venus, the Erotics of the Market. So you were combining.
Yeah, our episode I think might have been titled "The Erotics of the Market" or something.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah. So yeah, these both of these examples are helpful for, and one of the ways that they obviously are thinking about rigidity is in terms of molarity, right? So molar or macro politics would be based on rigidity, and as they show, there's also the third type of line, exemplified by the line of flight, which is defined by quanta. It's very similar to how they've been thinking of the strata in the body without organs, right? And so remember we were saying it's not about destratifying wildly, it's about tipping the scale, tipping towards the body without organs. And they say something similar about, like, if the state apparatus is, through overcoding, always attempting to rigidify and make rigid segments out of the quanta that is constantly leaking and eluding their zone of power, it's the supple line that kind of is either tilting towards the strata or rigidity, or tilting towards what we might say the body without organs, or the quantic side, right? So we saw something similar in their discussion of stratification, and I think that would be something that I would tell the listener at this point in the book, revisiting that third plateau on the geology of morals and stratification would probably not just shed light on this plateau, but more light on that other one, right? I think there is something of jumping back and forth to the plateaus and refreshing our thoughts that is always very helpful.
Something you said there, I wanted to jump on really quickly, because I know you've said desire leaking, something like that, so many times. So many times I've heard you describe this, and it came into clearer focus in this plateau. And this is something also that Virilio discusses, the kind of how power has this impotence in it where the more that power accumulates, particularly through technology, is his example, the more that additional vulnerabilities and limitations also proliferate, which I think goes to the point about desire or what have you leaking, about there being those, I forget what the specific term I wish I could recall it, but anyways, not important. But I think that's a very interesting avenue.
I think I said this before. The word for flight here in the French has nothing to do with flying in the air. It's flying as flight as in fleeing, but the same word also and verb form means leaking, right? So that's why desire, it flows, but it also flees and leaks, right? So all it's a very hydraulic figuration, if that makes sense. And I guess we're moving on. I suppose laying out the four errors is a nice food for thought, right? So we said, so don't think suppleness is going to make things better, because there are dangers of suppleness. Your examples were good. Their main focus is how microfascisms feed off of suppleness, right? So micropolitics isn't necessarily better. Obviously, macro and micropolitics are just two sides of the coin, and they make it pretty clear that the more molar and global a system, a state, whatever, the greater forces of molecularization are going on. Now, obviously, that leaves room for the quantum mutant line to deterritorialize and etc. But I think that their point is that it can also turn out that the same forms on a macro scale are reproduced on the micro scale, right? This is why I think the analysis in Anti-Oedipus about pre-conscious investments of interest, say in class, and unconscious investments of desire, the corresponding term they use here would be, for example, mass. We have to take both of those into account, because there are ways we can be, let's say, pre-consciously reactionary fascists and unconsciously revolutionary, and vice versa, right? There's a way at which we have to be aware of both of those types of investments, one of which is more molar and rigidified, and the other more supple. But that doesn't necessarily mean that. And in fact, for them, they're kind of like, hey, look, microfascisms in a certain sense they're a lot more dangerous. They can proliferate almost like a virus, right? They define it as that resonance of these black holes together, and that's that resonance, that swelling of the black holes resonating together. The micro black holes is what leads to that suicidal line of flight, which, outside of the state example they use from Virilio, we could obviously liken that to their warnings in the Body Without Organs plateau about destratifying wild. That is a suicidal line of flight.
Yeah, I ironically, what this brings to mind for me is, you've heard this, and people laugh at this. I scoff at this, and I certainly have as well. But I think in a certain register, it resonates as true from this perspective, and that when you hear conservative or whatever, wouldn't even say conservatives now, the sort of fascist, the fascists will say conservatism is the new punk rock, because basically it's a force for deterritorialization, or like this. That really speaks to, I think, the micro-fascism, the line of flight that becomes the line of suicidal death, and this kind of nihilistic yada yada.
No, that's good. So if the first error is axiological, right, it has to do with having a knee-jerk or just a presumption that suppleness is better or will make things better. The second is psychological, as if the molecular were in the realm of the imagination and applied only to the individual and inter-individual. But there is just as much social real, capital R, on one line as on the other. So it's not that the molecular is not, obviously, this seems to be like a given, but I think that for them, this again takes up arguments from Anti-Oedipus, for example, against ideology, as the explainer of fascism or fascist desire, which is a question they return to. If you recall in this chapter, for them, micropolitics is the only way of explaining this question that they had already asked Anti-Oedipus about: how does desire its own oppression? Now, they don't take the same line up that they had in Anti-Oedipus, where they're going to do a whole historiography of the genesis of Oedipus, and that chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus to show how it comes about that we desire our own repression. But they take a different tack in this plateau. But in any case, yeah, so desire is not imaginary. They've been saying that since the first volume of Capitalism and Schizophrenia. This is their critique of Kant when they credit Kant on the one hand for attributing creation to desire, but on the other hand, in the same movement, restricting it to flights of fancy and imaginary type of ideations. And so rendering it psychological, right? So this is pretty familiar, I think, to readers of Deleuze and Guattari. Anything to say on that second error?
I don't know if I would maybe bog us down in this, but since you mentioned Anti-Oedipus, I thought it was interesting here how they, in this plateau, work through the ways in which, so the implication perhaps would be, because we talked in Anti-Oedipus about how their quote unquote primitive societies ward off capitalism, or they ward off the state.
Yes.
The rigid segmentarity, so to speak. They really clarify that, I think, here relative to this.
They do.
Segmentarity, because of the sort of things like the discussion of polyvocality and the way that the rituals and so forth in primitive quote unquote primitive societies have, I don't know, it almost, I know they don't privilege the quote unquote privileged primitive society, but it feels like they show how that polyvocality and the way that the quote unquote primitive society handles these issues, I don't know, the lack of rigidity I don't know. It seems like they're cheating to one side a little bit, let's say. Like they don't necessarily want to say one is good and one is bad, but I think the kind of implication is like a little bit less rigidity in the primitive society seems like a better by implication, even though they might not want to go that far. I just get that impression to some extent.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And the warding off of the state in particular, I think I don't know, that became a lot more clear to me in A Thousand Plateaus than Anti-Oedipus specifically.
Yeah, they acknowledge that even if they show that there's a tendency to identify the supple with the primitive and the rigid with the modern, it's obvious, and there are distinctions, but it's obvious that they are, as I say, they are inseparable. They overlap. They're entangled. And here's this is 213. Primitive societies have nuclei of rigidity or arborification that as much anticipate the state as ward it off. And then conversely, modern societies are still suffused by a supple fabric without which their rigid segments would not hold. So this, we've seen same thing with their Plateau 5, when they go through the different semiotics. They can be de jure, to use their term, identified singularly, but they're de facto mixed. We're going to see that in the smooth and the striated as well. But no, I'm glad you brought that up. And
yeah, because they say our societies are still suffused by a supple fabric without which their rigid segments would not hold. So I'm sure you can extrapolate backwards to there is some rigidity in the quote unquote primitive.
Yes,
to some extent, probably leans more towards a suppleness. But
and one of the places we can find rigidity is the way that anthropologists, Freud and Toto and Taboo, even Deleuze and Guattari, when they do a whole rereading of incest. Incest would be one of those rigidifiers, the different segments, the different segmentation of around kinship and tribe and clan, etc., has rigid aspects. Yes, I think for them, as they are wont to do, they will start with a kind of binary opposition and then be like, "Oh, we oversimplified things." Right. And they do that. They've done that numerous times, and they'll continue doing that. Those dualisms are not meant to be, to use the word, rigid. Right. All right. The third error concerning the molecular and supple segmentarity. The two forms are not the molar and molecular, right? Or the supple and the rigid. The two forms are not simply distinguished by size as a small form and a large form. Although it is true that the molecular works in detail and operates in small groups, this does not mean that it is any less coextensive with the entire social field than molar organization. Which kind of makes sense, right? Moles in chemistry are obviously formed by a certain amount of molecules. That's where Avogadro's constant comes in, right? When you want to calculate the number of molecules in a mole. And it's been a long time since I studied all that shit, so I'm obviously speaking very loosely here, but that's how you calculate like the atomic mass in the Mendeleevian how do you pronounce it? Mendeleevian, the fucking periodic table, right? That's how it's numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, based on the atomic weight assigned to the mole. Anyway, that's I probably need to go fact check everything I just said. But
Yeah, because I thought it was by number of I thought it was by number of electrons because hydrogen, which is number 1, if I'm not mistaken, only has 1 electron. But I'm dog shit at chemistry, so you can't take my word
cool.
for it.
No, it would be now there is an order in terms of free electrons, which is why you have the inert, the noble gases. But no, I don't think that is correct.
Atomic number is the total count of protons within an atom's nucleus, and it uniquely identifies a chemical element. For example, every atom with 6 protons is a carbon atom, regardless of its number of neutrons or electrons.
Yep.
So that's what I was thinking of, protons, not electrons.
Gotcha.
So that's where the number like 1 for hydrogen comes from.
Right. I mixed up atomic weight. Yeah. Thank you. See, I knew I needed to fact check something I said. We're fact checking live on air. Something we rarely do, folks.
Yeah, try not to.
All right. The fourth error. Finally, the qualitative difference between the two lines does not preclude their boosting or cutting into each other. There is always a proportional relation between the two, directly or inversely proportional. And I think the way that doesn't necessarily make sense the first time I read it, or even rereading it, but I had to think about how they defined, as I said earlier, that the state apparatus, one of its goals through overcoding is to rigidify the mutant quantum flows that as best it can, right? This is why there's that inverse or direct proportionality between the rigid and the supple within a system. And also why that analogy of tipping the strata, tipping the assemblage away from the strata towards the body without organs to allow a little bit of freedom is similar to the supple being tipping towards the mutant quantum flow and towards rigidity. And then I love this. This again comes back to something we've seen them use. They almost claim it as an axiom in other places. Like we saw this in the major and minor. It's 2 more M's, right? So we have the molecular and the molar. The major and the minor in terms of standard languages. The more standardized major a language, the more forces of minorization at work, right? And conversely, minor languages are under the pressures of a coefficient of majorization and standardization, right? So like they say here, and this is 215 at the bottom, in the first case, the stronger the molar organization is, the more it induces a molecularization of its own elements, relations, and elementary apparatuses. And I was thinking of this earlier when I brought this up first or hinted at it. When the machine becomes planetary or cosmic, there is an increasing tendency for assemblages to miniaturize to become microassemblages. So yeah, I mean that itself is a way of also glossing that last error about the way in which they are proportional inversely or directly, however you want to think about it. The stronger the molar, the more active the molecular at work, coinciding with it and infusing it. So I think that's important to remember. And I believe you can apply this law or this axiom, this theoretical paradigm to, again, the whole discussion of stratification.
I guess.
Go ahead.
I was going to go back to Leibniz and the differential calculus. Mm-hmm. And how that really, I don't know, there's like the 2 poles of the molecular and the molar, which are not discrete. They're not discrete in the sense that there's a feedback loop between them, or they say that the lines intersect or cut or what have you. But I think the differential calculus really is a great metaphor for how that relationship between those 2 poles actuates in terms of the line, right? The infinitesimals would correspond to a micropolitics, whatever micro interactions or like that level, like those interactions shape and help define the molar just as much as the molar direction of the line begins to shape the way in which the molecular interactions, what direction they go in, we might say.
Yeah, I guess I would add to that, no, I won't add anything to that right now, but I'm glad you brought up Leibniz and the infinitesimal, because that obviously would be where some of this explanation of the quanta and the quote unquote pure flow. They say on 218, following Clausewitz's intuition, the war machine is very different. It is a flow than the state apparatus. It is a flow of absolute war stretching between an offensive and a defensive pole, and is marked only by quanta, psychic and material forces that are like the nominal liquid assets of war. And then they say, we may say of the pure flow that it is abstract yet real, ideal yet effective, absolute yet differentiated, quote unquote. So there's the differential, and the abstract yet real thing is an allusion to what he always loves to quote from Proust, right? Real without being actual, ideal without being abstract, abstract yet real, ideal yet effective, absolute yet differentiated. So that's important to go ahead.
I was just going to reference a little movie called, God, what is it? The Gene Hackman movie, not The Hunt for Red October, but Crimson Tide. Crimson Tide.
Oh, yeah, right.
Gene Hackman, captain of a nuclear submarine, quotes Clausewitz and says, "War is the extension of politics by other means," which I think is quite interesting as it pertains to micropolitics, right? Because basically the implication of micropolitics is that everything is political, and these little quantum fluctuations in relations between things can drive the way that the line proceeds or whatever, right?
Yes. Was it, when I last visited, was it Crimson Tide or was it The Hunt for Red October that we watched?
I think it was The Hunt for Red October. Pretty sure.
Because I was thinking about how they discussed something like about May 68, and a lot of people, they say a very old, outdated landowner. Okay. This is 216. As Gabriel Tard said, what one needs to know is which peasants in which areas of the south of France stopped greeting the local landowners. A very old, outdated landowner, in this case, judged things better than a modernist. It was the same with May 68. Those who evaluated things in macro political terms understood nothing of the event because something unaccountable was escaping. The politicians, the parties, the unions, many leftists were utterly vexed. They kept repeating over and over again that quote unquote conditions were not right. A molecular flow was escaping, minuscule at first, then swelling without ever ceasing to be unassignable. And I was just thinking about, like, in The Hunt for Red October, right? The whole tension is between knowing whether or not Sean Connery's character is defecting, and that kind of unassignability that his character has, and a little bit of the unpredictability with that. I'm not going to flesh out the example too much because now I might run into some problems there, but he's literally, quote unquote, fleeing, right? Defecting. And that could be a lure or a trap or a ruse to be set for. In any case, on the macro level, like enemy, combatant, seek and destroy. But on the micro level, is it fucking, what's his name? Alec Baldwin's character that kind of like figures it out. And is like, his character is sensing that micro political.
Oh, right. That's a good view. Very good. Very good.
Yeah. That hey, he fucking wants to defect, and pretty much no one else believes him, right? All the generals are like, what the bullshit, right? Because they're not thinking on that level. But he's also an outsider, so they're not going to listen to him, right? I forget, is he work for the FBI?
He's a CIA. He's a CIA analyst.
Yeah. So he's a CIA analyst without any like military ranking.
I think he was in the military, but they,
okay.
As an analyst, they still poo-poo him. Yeah.
Lower on the hierarchical, rigid.
Right.
Right.
Good. Very good.
So he's got a wager that he's reading that little unassignable line of flight correctly, because obviously he's putting a lot at stake. Obviously risking so many lives if he's wrong. In any case, yeah. So that's just a fun little example.
Also, an interesting example of, let's say, the war machine, because the war machine is not. It's captured by the state, but it is not part of the state per se. And certainly in The Hunt for Red October, it basically, I don't know if we have to go into the plot, but too much. But it's a Russian, I should say, Soviet submarine captain. Basically steals this new technology that allows the submarine to be run silently, to become imperceptible. If you want
right there you go,
yada yada. So he certainly goes to how the war machine is not part of the state, but then obviously the U.S. sort of captures that war machine and appropriates it for itself in a way in the film.
Yeah. And you're remembering the little bit of time we have spent, I guess, talking to Henry Summers Hall, the 12th Plateau, where their first axiom about the war machine is the war machine is exterior to the state apparatus. So you're anticipating what we will read later. As these plateaus get a lot longer, we'll probably have to dedicate more than one episode to.
Yeah. This one might honestly deserve 2 episodes.
It's possible. It's possible. There's a lot to talk about.
But they do mention the war machine in this plateau, just to be clear.
Yes. And that line, those lines I just read about Clausewitz and a little bit more elsewhere. I guess to switch it up, what do you make, or what do you think about their turn to Gabriel Tard and saying that his brand of microsociology had been castigated and disparaged by Durkheim in the similar way as Cuvier attacked Saint-Hilaire? I thought that I didn't remember him saying that. Again, in the third plateau, Deleuze kind of dramatizes, Deleuze and Guattari dramatize, or they have Challenger. If you remember, I told you it was like they put their words into the mouth of Professor Challenger in order to make fun of themselves. But if you remember, the way they dramatize it is that Professor Challenger is like giving this lecture, right, about strata, and at a certain point he starts having a puppet show, right? It's Cuvier, his allies against Saint-Hilaire. So I know that with your sociology background, you've obviously been exposed to Durkheim. And I know that we've talked about reading some of his work and discussing it together. So what do you make of this opposition that Durkheim is trying to explain, or trying to analyze? He wants to analyze these great collective representations, whereas Tard thinks that there's a begging of the question by giving yourself such an easy target, when what needs to be explained is the quote unquote similarity of millions of people, right? So again, Tard saying the great molar formations are already presuppose. It's kind of like you could say forest for the trees shit, but analyzing the forest instead of the trees. I don't know. But yeah, I guess, what do you think about this opting of Tard over Durkheim?
Unfortunately, I'm going to disappoint you, because as much as I know about Durkheim, I don't think Tard ever came up in any sociology courses that I took.
I'm not surprised.
But I certainly would emphasize, obviously, Durkheim as a pretty much, one would consider him to be part of the functionalist school of sociology. And sociology itself as a discipline really gets its start analyzing the kind of molar, the sort of larger scale aspects of the group's masses and so forth, rather than later on. Now, later on, you do get, I forget what it's called relative to sociology. And I wish I had my notes, because I could go back and look, because I did take, I don't know if it's social psychology, basically. From the sociology perspective, there is a social psychology or equivalent field of study in sociology that looks at the sort of molecular, so to speak. But I can't for the life of me recall any of the thinkers or much of the theory. But there is that. It does get there, right? As the field progresses. I think it's certainly a more recent 20th century, probably mid to late 20th century advance in sociology, where those molecular or small scale interactions begin to take greater or begin to have more importance, or whatever, begin to be discussed more so in sociology.
Gotcha. Yeah. No, I guess I just found it an interesting juxtaposition, their turn to Tard. I know that I can't remember. Obviously, one of the things that I have 3 exclamation points by, which wasn't from this reading, it's from 2000 and page 219. Okay, let's say. Okay. Going from the quote I just said, the similarity of millions of people is what Tard wanted to study, right? So they say that is why Tard was interested instead in the world of detail, or of the infinitesimal, going to the Leibniz stuff. The little imitations, oppositions, and inventions constituting an entire realm of sub-representative matter. And as you may know, the differential with the infinitesimal, Deleuze in Difference Repetition is interested in the dramatization of the idea as pertaining to sub-representative dynamisms, obviously foregoing representation as the mode of, one of the modes in which the dogmatic image of thought moves. To continue the quote, Tarda's best work was his analysis of a minuscule bureaucratic innovation or a linguistic innovation. The Durkheimians answered that what Tard did was psychology or interpsychology, not sociology. But that is true only in appearance as a first approximation. A micro-imitation does seem to occur between two individuals, but at the same time and at a deeper level, it has to do not with an individual, but with a flow or a wave. Imitation is the propagation of a flow. Opposition is binarization, the making binary of flows. Invention is a conjugation or connection of different flows. What, according to Tard, is a flow? It is belief or desire, the two aspects of every assemblage. A flow is always of belief and desire. Beliefs and desires are the basis of every society because they are flows and as such are quote unquote quantifiable. They are veritable social quantities, whereas sensations are qualitative and representations are simple resultants. The three exclamation points are what is a flow? It is belief or desire. Flow is always of belief and of desire. Oh shit, what? Because in Anti-Oedipus, where we're not really, what we are told is that desire flows, right? And that's why they analyze flows and obviously machines, etc. But this notion, it makes sense though that belief and desire here would be conjugated together and that Anti-Oedipus do look for it. We can already see in what I was saying about pre-conscious investments would obviously have to do with a certain structure of beliefs, right? Just as much as unconscious investments, even if they aren't. I suppose one can have beliefs without being conscious of them, right? So it's interesting to retroactively reread Anti-Oedipus in the light of A Thousand Plateaus. And I think this plateau in particular sheds a lot of light on those things. It's obvious that How Do You Make Yourself a Body Without Organs sheds light on Anti-Oedipus as well. Though, again, it's, as I've told you before, it's complicated trying to articulate a clear and distinct concept of body without organs because, as Deleuze himself recognized, he and Guattari did not share the same concept of body without organs, which in Deleuze's mouth, we have to put the emphasis on concept because I think what Deleuze is trying to articulate is not necessarily that they disagreed. Disagreement, obviously, dissensus can be and is often productive. It's the fact that I believe Deleuze was interested in tackling certain problems with the concept, and Guattari obviously was approaching different problems, right? Because concepts are in tandem and in conjunction and interacting with problems and the way in which a problem is defined. We have the solutions we deserve based on the definition of problems. So obviously Guattari was setting out from a different set of criteria, and it's most likely due to his work as an analyst, right? And as a militant and yada, yada. I'm not trying to make it a mere biographical difference between the two thinkers, just it's not biographical, right? They are wanting to apply these concepts in ways that illuminate their own interests and desires. So in any case, yeah, I just thought that was interesting to see this use of a thinker who probably was out of fashion in France then, but I am assuming Deleuze and Guattari, like the reason why I know about some of these minor thinkers, I say minor, but less well-known thinkers like Simondon, like Rouillet, etc., is because of Deleuze and Guattari. And Tard is definitely another person, and I think that's why a number of Deleuzians have spent time writing about him and his work.
There's another sociologist we could bring up here, and that would be Marx himself, I think, relative to this discussion between, or like base and superstructure theory, right? Because that almost has a certain correlation to the molecular and the molar to some extent, right? And obviously, like the Marxist dialectic would imply the way in which those two scales of the process of what have you, of production or whatever, really relations, social relations or relations themselves between objects and humans and what have you, operate on two different scales. And obviously, I don't know that Marx maybe gets into the molecular as much, but it is interesting to think about, right? Because Marx prioritizes the base, right? The economic base is the primary mover of society, right? Like
it's the last instance, to use like the Althuserian turn of phrase, right? Yeah.
And I think so. Emphasizing I guess that I don't know, maybe it's not so distinct as far as, right,
Yeah, they're definitely
the
yeah.
molecular and the molar as far as it pertains to production, right? Because it's an assemblage of both,
Mhm, mhm.
right? It's like the micro exchanges themselves at that level, but also the sort of superstructure of capitalism at the molar level determines, right? There is a dialectic between, you could call it that, between the molar and the molecular, right? Without necessarily privileging one or the other.
Yeah, yeah. And I do think that I think that if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're saying is that there's obviously a way of looking at, I guess, our frame of reference of looking at the base and superstructure based on the molar or the molecular kind of changes the inflection that we have.
Yeah, I was just thinking about just really the interaction between the two scales of relations or exchange, or I don't even know how to capture all of it, but I don't know. It's just something I was wrestling with relative to the molecular and the molar, and
Yeah,
how they, I don't know. Just I suppose more so to say that Deleuze and Guattari kind of, they don't directly cite Marx here, but I think you could see a certain through line, perhaps.
they do bring up Marxism, which, if you remember, they say society is not a society. It's not true that society is defined by its contradictions according to a certain Marxism. They say that's only true on the molar level, right? On the molecular level, societies are defined by lines of flight. Let me see if I can find that.
Yeah, I definitely remember reading that. That's probably why I had that thought to begin with.
Shit, I can't seem to find. I know where it is on the page. I just gotta find the page. It's fine.
I don't know if the pagination is correct in my PDF, but I think it's 216, about midway through. It's
It's
in
way up.
parentheses.
It is wrongly said, in Marxism in particular, that a society is defined by its contradictions. This is true only on the larger scale of things. From the viewpoint of micropolitics, a society is defined by its lines of flight, which are molecular. There's always something that flows or flees that escapes the binary organizations, the resonance apparatus, and the overcoding machine. Yeah. And they say above, they say, I think this is where they quote or they footnote Aurelio. This starts on the bottom of 215, where they say the administration of a great organized molar security has as its correlate a whole micro management of petty fears, a permanent molecular insecurity, to the point that the motto of domestic policymakers might be a macropolitics of society by and for a micropolitics of insecurity. And that's footnote 12 is to Virilio's book, which still isn't translated on the insecurity of the territory. However, the second case is even more important. Molecular movements do not complement, but rather thwart and break through the great worldwide organization. That is what French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was saying in his military and political geography lesson. The more balanced things are between East and West and an overcoding an overarmed dualist machine, the more destabilized they become along the other north-south line. There is always a Palestinian or Basque or Corsican to bring about a regional destabilization of security.
Very interesting.
And we can always come back to this plateau. But I suppose if we did want to, I should ask you. I definitely think we should at least approach the fascism, microfascism, totalitarianism stuff. That goes back to our cold open. But I know you've got some good notes. Was it, before we do that, to kind of like start closing out? Was there anything you wanted to touch on?
Yeah, one of the things I found interesting thinking about this connection to Leibniz and this plateau in particular is the Leibnizian idea of preformation, and which goes to, I think, kind of the even Rouillet and the egg in a certain sense, right? Because or even the way that Deleuze and Guattari discuss the way that the state emerges in
Fully formed, yeah.
anti-Oedipus. Yeah. So and it goes to microfascism too, right? Because it's these little shards, these little infinitesimal shards of fascism at the molecular level reach a critical mass.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so
they use
they
the word
crystallize.
crystallization.
Yeah.
Yep.
So and the same sort of applies. You can see this kind of similar thing in the way that we talked about desire leaking, right? Because the more that power concentrates, or really to your example that you just used as far as the east-west, like the more that binary sharpens, let's say, the more the north-south axis becomes unstable or what have you, right? It's like the main idea that I'm trying to get to, I think, is that the little infinitesimals, so to speak, the micropolitics of whatever direction the line is going to take, whether it be a line of flight or a line of death, are already within the fabric of the now, right? So if we want to use the example of Marx, right? Marx thinks that communism will emerge from out of capitalism. The sort of as capitalism begins to reach its late stage, we might say, right? Like the more that it becomes this global hegemonic system, the more it undermines its own stability by that process of molecularization, right? But those little molecules are always present. The pregnant is the present is, or the past is, the now is pregnant with the future, right? We can't perceive it, right? Because of the whatever the quanta or the flow or what have you, right? We don't perceive those things, but they're always there. And once they hit a critical mass, then the thing emerges, the new paradigm or whatever, like the process of deterritorialization and reterritorialization, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess since we're accelerating, kind of like Professor Challenger having to go faster and faster, the last section of the chapter, which isn't very long because there are line breaks. We cannot say that one of these three lines, right, the mutant quantic line, the supple line, and the rigid line, are that any of these three lines is bad and another good by nature and necessarily. The study of the dangers of each line is the object of pragmatics or schizoanalysis. I'm not going to read all of this, but as they list the four great dangers: fear, clarity, power, and disgust. Right? Fear. This goes back to that quote of Blanchot. Right? We in flight from flight. We flee from flight. We rigidify our segments. Right? We instead of wildly destratifying. Oh, they said one of the errors, one of the dangers of wildly destratifying is that the strata come even harder back on top of us, right? So there's a way in which we flee from flight and rigidify our segments, right? Because the more rigid the segmentarity, the more reassuring it is for us. That is what fear is and how it makes us retreat into the first line. And if you recall, I brought this up. I can't remember the last time I brought this up, but I'll be quick. Deleuze and Guattari, obviously reaching all the way back to Plato, one of the great enemies of philosophy is opinion. And as we know, art, science, and philosophy in their creative measures are all ways of dealing with chaos and like slicing a little hole that lets a little bit of chaos trickle in order to interact with it in a way that is creative. Now, opinion is obviously what can lead to what Deleuze defines in difference repetition as, we can either call it stupidity, we can call it foolishness, bêtise. It is basically the failure of creating concepts and therefore of thinking. Right. It is basically the means by which we participate in a certain dogmatic, moral, and orthodox image of thought that actually is literally only an image and not actual thinking. Right. We are not confronted with the violence of a sign that forms a problem that forces us to think. Opinion is very reassuring and very stabilizing. And so on that front, we can always tend to fall back into it. And so there's something in this analysis of fear and rigidifying our segments that makes me think about the discussion of opinion and what is philosophy. Opinion is precisely the great protector from the chaos. And we can imagine that rigidifying our segments is a way of precluding ourselves from interacting with chaos in a creative way, and also of giving ourselves a little bit of security to bring back their reference to security and insecurity. The second danger is clarity, right? So if the first danger pertains mostly to the rigid line, the second danger pertains to the supple line, and we start to see suppleness everywhere, right? Everything has the clarity of the microscope, they say. So they're using it in a virtually literal way. But I brought this up earlier in passing. Supple segmentarity runs the risk of reproducing in miniature the affectations of the rigid. The family is replaced by community, conjugality by a regime of exchange and migration. Worse, micro-Oedipuses crop up, micro-fascism lay down the law, etc. Right? And they end by saying, we have overcome fear, we have sailed from the shores of security only to enter a system that is no less concentricized, right? Like concentric circles, no less organized, the system of petty insecurities that leads everyone to their own black hole in which to turn dangerous, possessing a clarity on their situation, role, and mission even more disturbing than the certitudes of the first line, which is obviously has fascist undertones, right? Like they say above, everything has clarity to the microscope. We think we have understood everything and draw conclusions. We are the new knights. We even have a mission. The third, and I'm being a little quick here, is power, capital P, pouvoir, not puissance, right? So power over, as Eugene Holland likes to say, versus power with. And they say it affects both lines. By both, they mean the rigid and the supple simultaneously. It stretches from the rigid segments with their overcoating and resonance to the fine segmentations with their diffusion and interactions and back again. Every man of power jumps from one line to the other. But this whole chain and web of power is immersed in a world of mutant flows that eludes them. This is why they're going to be most interested in the fourth danger, because it pertains to the line of flight. It is precisely its impotence that makes power so dangerous. The man of power will always want to stop the lines of flight, and to this end, to trap and stabilize the mutation machine and the overcoding machine. But he can do so only by creating a void. In other words, by first stabilizing the overcoding machine itself, by containing it within the local assemblage charged with effectuating it, in short, by giving the assemblage the dimensions of the machine. This is what takes place in the artificial conditions of totalitarianism, or the closed vessel. And we'll see that, like, for them, totalitarianism, unlike the resonance of the micro black holes with fascism, totalitarianism is more defined for them as the tendency to overcode all lines of flight and to block them off, right? As an ideal of no leaking, which is why they define zones of power by what is allowed to leak. And so totalitarianism has that ideal tendency to be absolute in its prevention of leaks. But there is a fourth danger as well. And this is the one that interests us most because it concerns the lines of flight themselves. And I believe this is discussed, right? We may well have presented these lines as a sort of mutation or creation drawn not only in the imagination, but also in the very fabric of social reality. We may well have attributed to them the movement of the arrow, the speed of an absolute, but it would be oversimplifying to believe that the only risk they fear and confront is allowing themselves to be recaptured in the end, letting themselves be sealed in, tied up, reknotted, reterritorialized, i.e. totalitarianism. They themselves emanate a strange despair, like an odor of death and immolation, a state of war from which one returns broken. They have their own dangers, distinct from the ones previously discussed. This, and that's discussed with a C, not with a G. This is exactly what led Fitzgerald to say, quote, I had a feeling that I was standing at the twilight of deserted range with an empty rifle in my hands and the targets down, no problem set, simply a silence with only the sound of my own breathing. My self-immolation was something sodden, dark. Why is the line of flight a war one risks coming back from defeated, destroyed, after having destroyed everything one could? This precisely is the fourth danger. The line of flight crossing the wall, getting out of the black holes, but instead of connecting with other lines and each time augmenting its valence, turning to destruction, abolition, pure and simple, the passion of abolition. This is, and they say, Plyce's line of flight in the strange war he wages like suicide, double suicide, a way out that turns the line of flight into a line of death. And they say, we're not invoking kind of death drive. What I would say, obviously I could just read till the end of, obviously on the next page, this is the cold open, where the last word I read in the cold open was deliometers. We can see that word, which they actually brought up for the first time in Introduction to Rhizome, it is about the measurement of, because they wanted to say like quantify writing, right? Schizoanalysis has been called all kinds of things, stratoanalysis, blah, blah, blah. And they bring up, maybe they call it deliometry, something like that. So obviously that would have to do with the measuring of that tendency of lines of flight to become lines of death, lines of abolition, passions for abolition, destruction. So deliometers is their way, their coinage, their neologism to describe quantifying this tendency inherent in lines of flight to become destructive, not just self-destructive, but self-destructive in a collective way, right? Which is why that in that line, Nazis announced to Germany what they were bringing, wedding bells and death, including their own death and the death of the Germans, basically death through the death of others, death of oneself, the death of others. So I guess that's, so I suppose, and it is interesting that we will get to see more of this resonance of the black holes, the micro black holes, and all of that. We'll get to see more of that later. But
Good, because I think we really need to unpack like black holes and resonance, because these two things are particularly murky in my head.
Yeah.
So I'm glad there's some more we can focus on that in the future.
Yeah, I would say I'm trying to look if there's a good line. But yes, so if totalitarianism is one big black hole, one molar black hole to try to plug the lines of flight, for them fascism rides a line of flight, right? And turns it into a self-destructive suicidal line, which makes it different. This is why they and again, I'm glad that you brought up that first axiom about the war machine, right? That it's exterior to the state, because in that cold open read, they're going to contrast totalitarianism as a state affair, right? But not as a war machine. Fascism involves a war machine. So that's another way of dividing up the differences. And so I do think that we'll want to come back to this fascism totalitarianism distinction when we get to Plateau 12, nomadology. Fascism is constructed on an intense line of flight. Let's see what else. Suicide is presented not as a punishment, right, but as the crowning glory of the death of others. They go pretty hard in this plateau, I got to say. And then they say, one can always say that it's just a matter of foggy talk and ideology, nothing but ideology. But that is not true. The insufficiency of economic and political definitions of fascism does not simply imply a need to tack on vague so-called ideological determinations. We prefer to follow Fay's inquiry, and they talk about him in a footnote more, where he's analyzing the language of fascism and totalitarianism, I believe, and they give him a lot of credit in that footnote. We prefer to follow Fay's inquiry into the precise formation of Nazi statements, which are just as much in evidence in politics and economics as in the most absurd of conversations. They always contain the quote-unquote stupid and repugnant cry, long live death, even at the economic level, where the arms expansion replaces growth and consumption, and where investment veers from the means of production towards the means of pure destruction. Paul Virilio's analysis strikes us as entirely correct in defining fascism not by the notion of the totalitarian state, but by the notion of the suicidal state. So-called total war seems less a state undertaking than an undertaking of a war machine that appropriates the state and channels into it a flow of absolute war whose only possible outcome is the suicide of the state itself. And then they have a long quote: if the war is lost, may the nation perish, which I believe is Hitler's telegram. And I'll read the last few sentences of the plateau. It was this reversion of the line of flight into a line of destruction that already animated the molecular focuses of fascism and made them interact in a war machine instead of resonating in a state apparatus. And they italicize this for emphasis. A war machine that no longer had anything but war as its object and would rather annihilate its own servants than stop the destruction. All the dangers of the other lines pale by comparison. So we will see too in the nomadology, I believe it may be one of their axioms or one of the theorems, because that's how that plateau is organized. They basically, or it could be one of their propositions. They basically state that the war machine does not have war as its object initially, right? This is the suicidal line. And this is why I think Ian Buchanan, I believe, is the one who suggested we shouldn't understand war machine might lead to misunderstandings and confusions. He prefers to call them metamorphic machines, which is interesting, and we'll have to return to that when we get the chance. Let me see. Okay, here's Proposition 9. This is 416. War does not necessarily have the battle as its object. And more important, the war machine does not necessarily have war as its object, although war and the battle may be its necessary result under certain conditions. And yeah, so we will come back to this question of the state appropriating the war machine, or with fascism, the war machine appropriating the state, right? And they, on almost the very last page of that plateau, the question is therefore less the realization of war than the appropriation of the war machine. It is at the same time that the state apparatus appropriates the war machine, subordinates it to political aims, and gives it war as its direct object. And obviously, this is they come back to total war, annihilation. So they're returning to this, even though they don't bring up the word. I don't see it here. They're returning to give us more information about fascism, and they talk about guerrilla warfare and revolutionary minority warfare, which would be obviously the opposite of this definition of fascist warfare, war machines, and reminds us of our discussion with Andrew Colt. Right. They say if guerrilla warfare, minority warfare, revolutionary and popular war are in conformity with the essence, is because they take war as an object all the more necessary for being merely supplementary. They can make war only on the condition that they simultaneously create something else, if only new, non-organic social relations. And they say the difference between the two poles, the fascist and the guerrilla, the difference between the two poles is great, even, and especially from the point of view of death, the line of flight that creates or turns into a line of destruction.
It is funny at the political level, like a lot of the economic policies that are being put in place by certain people. I don't even going to say their name, but they're really undermining the very thing that they seek to achieve by, you know what I mean, by tightening the grip, if you will.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of things like dollar, like the dollar is the world reserve currency, and how undermining that, like trying to, the more you incentivize other countries to innovate, so to speak, to take a line of flight, if you will. I'm thinking back, for example, this goes to like God Emperor of Dune, the way that Leto II, he oppresses the guild, for example, the Spacing Guild, as well as so that the Ixians, the technological advances, will make it so there's no reliance on spice to travel through space, for example, right? So by his opposition to, but he does it consciously, right? Like he's very, on the outside, he's opposing them and oppressing them, but like he is doing it rationally, thinking, okay, if I force this suppression of the production of spice, it's going to generate this line of flight, this molecular process, which is going to allow humanity to escape its reliance on this one point, this one planet, right? This one substance, if you will. I don't know. I think that's quite interesting.
That's good. That's good. I like it. I like it.
Goes back to, I think, the leaking of desire, right, to some extent, which I've harped on a bit. But did you have anything else you wanted to add before we close out?
I know you're right that this could have been 2 episodes on this chapter or this plateau, even though it's not that long. But there's a lot here, and
there's a tremendous amount of material here.
Yeah, I did feel like we were able to cover some of the big. We covered the 4 errors. We covered the 4 dangers pertaining to the lines. We quoted a lot from the book, which I think for listeners,
it's always
hopefully they don't. I just hopefully they don't find that annoying. But I don't think we've quoted as much as at least I have. I felt a lot of, if this series is meant to help with reading A Thousand Plateaus, I think it is good to be quoting the material that seems significant. Obviously, you can't quote the whole thing,
right? Or we just be doing an audiobook.
Yeah, just be an audiobook. But certainly these passages are good. And maybe we should, I guess one last thing I would say is I assume, I could be wrong, but I assume 1933 is just pointing to when Hitler rose to power or the Nazis rose to power. I know they don't, that's just my guess. But maybe we should start with a the reading. Yeah, cold open. A quote, paragraph, lines for each plateau that might help to crystallize. Yeah, okay. No, I know he wasn't elected, but he was appointed, right? Yeah. So January 30th, 1933. I guess they could have dated it. We've seen them date a specific day, but yeah, they just say 1933. So thanks for fact checking that for me, buddy. I wanted to make sure. Wasn't elected.
That's why I get the producer credit.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, you producer, MC, charming, handsome host, co-host, the co-host with the most. But yeah, I feel pretty good. I feel pretty good about what we covered.
The last thing that I want to say is I will again bring up Leibniz because I'm counterintuitively just such a fan. I think predominantly just based of Deleuze's reading, which I think really takes Leibniz, who I think he even is commonly associated with this kind of rigid, deterministic thing, right? The best of all possible worlds. You know what I mean? There's a certain rigidity. He's tying everything to God, right? And that sort of very deterministic outlook. But really, Deleuze transforms him into this kind of radical thinker of difference, which I think is so counterintuitive. But there's enough in the text and of Leibniz to justify it. And it's fucking fascinating to me. I love it.
Oh, for sure. And
I think it's just a brilliant creative reading.
yeah, I remember, I can't remember exactly what Daniel Smith said, whether it would be, but I think he did say one of his favorite books was Leibniz's. I gotta look up the fucking title, but it was a book he wrote. I think it's called like The New System of something. Fuck, what's it called? Hold on. Fact check me. Google, I'm just blanking on the title. Google Leibniz New System. See if that pulls up anything. New System of the Nature. And I'm not sure if that's the one I'm thinking of. Fuck. It might be.
It certainly seems like it would have to be this, because
would it be? Oh wait, no. I think it has a title similar to Locke's title on an essay on the understanding. Is it something like Leibniz? Yeah, New Essays on Human Understanding. There we go. I think I remember Daniel Smith and saying this was one of his favorite books. Maybe he was arguing. Maybe it had to do with you asking him about monads, Leibniz, the BWO.
Right.
And he might have brought this up in that context, or I might have asked him about one of his favorite books. I don't remember, but I remember being a little surprised by that. And so maybe at some point that's something we got to dig into, because you keep bringing up Leibniz. It's making me want to have to sit down and read some of them with you.
Monadology.
Yeah, the monadology.
Nomadology. So it's definitely there. It's
yeah.
It's an infinitesimal in how does this work?
Give me something we can look at. The monadology. Obviously, those are two of his most famous ones, but I do remember Smith saying that the New Essays was something that should be read and appreciated, and he recommended it highly.
Yeah, you might have to shoot him an email and see if he remembers by chance.
Yeah,
if he's got something.
I'll ask him and maybe get him to come on and talk with us about it. Although I know that he's also, I think Charles told us that he's compiling a second book of his essays.
Dan is of his own essays?
Of his own essays, yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. So anyway, man, yeah, this was good, and we'll have to figure out something for next week.
Let's go ahead and close out this edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. We'll see y'all next week.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is outcast, to the whole state of things, the pure bias without option anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.